And thank you so much to the organizers, not just for the invitation, but for persisting when I tried to defer, because this is outside of my area of professional expertise. And what you do when somebody invites you to talk outside of your area of professional expertise is you say, maybe you just don't know the person. You use the momentum to open a door. And they said, no, you talk tough on Twitter. We want to hear these stories. I said, you really want to hear the stories? And so I'm going to tell a couple of stories. The forward button, there we go. I like to start with conclusions, so you know what you're getting into. And my experience is that when you have leaders at any level, and I'm talking about individual contributors who are leaders without formal authority, I'm talking about funding agencies. When leaders decide that diversity, equity, inclusion, safety in the workplace are part of the leadership job, it works. We know the tools. We know what to do. You can listen to any of the other speakers, and those tools are there. And lacking that personal, it's my job as a leader to make a space around me, what did you call it? The separate universe, where things are better. Lacking that leadership, even those best practices are treated as additional work, and you don't have time, and they're not a priority, and they just fall down and do more damage than good. I had the opportunity at the Broad to work for a really remarkable human being, Samantha Singer. At one point, she was the chief operating officer. I was temporarily responsible for all of IT. And I came in, as I frequently did, complaining about culture. And she said this to me. She said, there's a point in your leadership development where culture becomes your job. And I think about that a lot. And then she taught me how to change culture by changing behavior. But with this behind me, I want to tell a story of the first time I really spoke up for culture and inclusion. It was 2014. I was working at the Broad. We were responsible. I got there. We had like 36 petabytes of unique data on just barely enough disk. We were always laying down railroad track in front of the DNA sequencing outfit. And because of that, data storage vendors were very interested in talking to us about how they could sell to us and solve our problems. One of those was a startup, interesting tech. We actually were doing a proof of concept with it. It was already in my data center. And they said, hey, Chris, would you come out and talk to our engineering and sales team meeting? And it was close to Boston, so it wasn't a junket. These kinds of things have good mutual benefit. I get to advocate for my features. I get to know the senior people who I will bug when they don't fix the problems with their system. So I said, sure, and I went out. And it was a meeting a little bit bigger than this one. And the gender ratios were more extreme than they are in this room right now. 60, 70 people. There were 2 women in attendance. One was handing out name badges. One was serving coffee. And I knew I wasn't supposed to be on Manals. I knew I was supposed to do something about this. I didn't know what to do. I was very nervous. I was there in professional capacity. I didn't want to mess up my job. And so I sat and I tried to figure out what to do. And I listened to the national sales lead for this company. And he had the most hyper-masculinized presentation you will ever hear. Everything was about opening of kimonos and getting into beds and and I could tell he was of the old school of sales where it was steak dinner, whiskey, cigars, maybe Vegas, And I looked around and I was like, well, what do I do? And so I got up, I gave my talk, and I did nothing in my talk. But afterwards, I got to meet the executive team, and I said, we made our chitty chatty, and then I said, do you know you have no women here? And they said, we were just talking about that. That's funny, right? It's weird. Yeah, it is pretty weird. And I made one of those snap decisions, and I said, well, I don't know what's wrong with your organization, but I don't know if it's catching, and I don't want my team to get it. And so we're going to cancel this proof of concept. You can take your gear back out of my data center. And going forward, I need your team to not talk to my team. I need your team to maybe talk to me. And this is not permanent. But until we figure out what's up here, I think this is important. And the room got real cold, and the meeting ended, and I got in the car, and I spent the whole drive back to Boston second-guessing myself, thinking I probably just did something wrong there. That was probably a mistake, right? The next day, one of the executives emailed, said, can we meet? Sure, And he comes to my office, and he was visibly emotional. And he said, Chris, thank you so much for saying that. He goes, I have wanted to say that. He said, I was bullied as a kid. I'm a gay man. And I have wanted to do something to make things better for people in my organization. And I realized I'm the chief executive of this company. This is my turn, right? I was like, what are you going to do? He's like, I don't know. I was like, I don't know either. Good luck, you know? And away he went. And several months later, he reached out again. He said, I want you to meet somebody. We have hired a global head of diversity and inclusion. And she's fantastic. I met her. She was a woman, a LGBTQ person, a person of color, and physically disabled. So she covered all of the bases. Maximally intersectional, right? And I asked her, like, okay, so what are you going to do? She said, well, I report to the CEO. That's important. I need broad discretion to do this. And I said, well, what are your marching orders? She said, well, he asked me that. And I said, let's do a metrics-based approach. I think we should aim mathematically for 1 testicle per employee. And I'll leave it to you to figure out a way to get there. You know, and I was like, wow, okay, that's a hammer, as somebody said. And this is a conditional success. I feel like I made a dent, right? I say it's a conditional success because I looked on LinkedIn just before giving this talk, and they're still mostly a boys' shop, right? I have 2 more stories, and they're both failures. And I think it's important to visit failures in this because I feel like we as a community of allies and advocates do wrong things sometimes. And so the next time out, I had quit my job at the Broad. I was Dwan Consulting. And I was working with another data storage startup to help them develop a validated product case for the life sciences healthcare, you know, the thing consultants do. And the person I was working with put this thing on LinkedIn about 23 rules for sons, and it was all about how business is for men, and the norms of business are a strong handshake and being physically able and being male and having a hanky in case the women become emotional. You know, this is on LinkedIn, right? And this time I was empowered. I'm like, wow, it worked last time. I'm going to write a blog post. And I wrote a really articulate blog post. And he called me up. He was very upset. His boss called me up, said he thought it was mean of me to upset his employee. And then they just cut ties and nothing changed. So the goal is to convince people to join the team. And I'm talking about the good ones, right? If we're talking about actual harassment and abuse, prison, out. But supposedly these good folks who just don't see it as part of the job, hitting them in the face with a hammer doesn't change their mind, and changing their mind is what we need to do. And the third story is personal enough that I will just allude to it. I lost a friend of 20 years over this stuff. Similar sort of thing. Just stopped talking to me and didn't change the corporate behavior that we were trying to talk about. So, but I did a little study because one of the things that these folks say, oh, I forgot a really, really important part on the first story. The reason that I mentioned the sales guy is that they had taken a look at their sales statistics. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows about the silent failure, where when something just doesn't look good to you, you walk away. Well, it turned out half their market was walking away from them. When this guy was great, as long as they were the contacts who reacted well to his pitch. But they were artificially limiting their market to half of what was available because there are a lot of decision makers who did not want steak dinners and whiskey and cigars. Right? They didn't want to meet after work. They didn't want it to be an alcohol-fueled thing, you know. And so I think that piece of it, saying, hey, just in terms of reaching out to a market, there are a substantial number of decision makers that if you open up to a broader population, you do better business. I took a look, and I work in the Boston biotech world. There are 3 major venture firms. And I went to each of their websites, and I got the list of companies they've invested in, about 162 companies since the early 90s. 115 of those companies are still in business under the original names. And I went to the About Us leadership link that all of them have. And I looked at pictures and I looked at names. And I clicked on bios and I believed gendered pronouns. And if you just sort by the CEO, another C-level exec, and then down to the director level, I replicated these same numbers that we've been seeing in other studies, right? We've got this bench, which is not yet making it into, you know, which is a quarter of the C-level execs. And this like low representation in the C-suite. And that is paralleled on boards of directors, because to get on a board of director, you have to have been a C-level exec for a while. And to get to be the chair of a board of directors, you have to have been on a number of boards. And I think that this could be very easily corrected if the people funding, and I heard a couple of funding organizations say this, said it's unacceptable to have an all-male board. That's not the kind of organization we fund. It bugs me that we're handing out, I looked up $8 billion in Boston Biotech in 2018, and this persists. I feel like it could use a little attention. It got really interesting when I spread out the leaders by role, or by specialty. So what I found is that we didn't have one homogeneous lump, right? We have a pair, we have sort of three distributions. We've got the law is actually pretty, the law schools have kind of figured it out. The strategy office is about 50-50. We've got, 85% representation in communications, the 75-80 in human resources, project management. And then in the science leadership of Boston Biotech, it's exactly the same as the CEOs. So that thing where I said we had a good bench, apparently not in the scientific leadership. That bums me out. And I think that we need to convince leaders that this is actually a piece of the job. So on to what doesn't work. What doesn't work? This is a beautiful beach that I went to. I was doing nothing, right? So merely not being sexist doesn't cut it. Merely having a wife and daughters doesn't cut it. Talking about those facts doesn't change the status quo. If you wish to change the status quo, you must act. It's also the case that saying, well, a woman told me this, it must be free of bias, is not borne out by the science. We all know, underrepresented groups internalize the biases of their culture. That's why there's societal biases. Assuming that teams led by women are free of bias, not safe. We all have biases. There are some things that do harm, and in my experience, and I would love to talk with you folks about this, my experience is that quotas applied without a great deal of finesse cause harm. And they cause harm because they do create alternative hiring criteria. And then people learn from being on these teams that the folks who are supposed to be getting this boost, they learn that those people are not as experienced as them. It's possible to get around that, but it takes a lot of sensitivity, a lot of nuance. So I think that merely applying quotas actually hurts. And as I said before, blog posting and punching down on social media has had the effect in my life of driving potential allies away rather than helping. And as I said before, I want to be clear that if we have a situation where somebody's in danger, where there are crimes being committed, name and shame, drive them up. We're talking about convincing people to work with us here. So it does work. And I feel like this has been adequately covered, so I can skim forward really quite rapidly. That did remove everything from the job requirements that's not actually in the job. We all know the statistics about folks who, women tending to not apply for a job that they're not qualified for on paper, and men, as was pointed out, just pushing themselves forward and saying, yes, that's me. I make a practice of leveraging recruiters and insisting that recruiters bring me batches of candidates that are non-homogenous. They always whine about it. They say, but it'll take longer. I'm like, do your job. You're getting like 1/3 to 1/2 of a year's salary for a senior position that we're recruiting. I want pools of candidates, not just whoever you found at the Starbucks next to the Broad. Blind your auditions. Again, it's a little bit more work, but initials rather than names that signal gender or ethnicity. Scrape off the name of the institution if it's accredited. I don't think the requirement is actually a master's from MIT, so I don't think that should be in the initial triage. Structuring interviews, when we get down to that thing where just talk to them, see if they fit. That winds up being like, do they look like me? That's always how it seems to come back. This is a person I get along with because we've got some shared cultural cues. And then finally, the confirmation bias thing, where if I send my team to interview somebody, they come back and they look at me and they're like, well, what did you think first? I'm like, no, we've got to write down your opinions, collate them, and then make a decision. This is my good friend, Dave. I get a lot. People say that doing these things would take way too much time. We would die. We can't, having a startup is hard. Hiring is hard. And I was like, well, how hard? Have we quantified it? I have not found anybody who's willing to quantify how much harder it is to do a solid recruiting process. And what Dave said around this was recruiting is the most important part of your job in building a company. Why would you skimp on time there? Do you not want the very best people there? In terms of the workplace, I believe strongly in assigning sponsors, and we can haggle about the word, whether it's a mentor or a buddy or a sponsor, but every single new employee needs somebody who, in many cases, will introduce them to where the team hangs out. You don't spend that couple of weeks trying to find the lunchroom or whatever. And then the sponsor needs to be evaluated in their performance review on the success of the person that they're sponsoring. It has to be part of the job. This is how we teach individual contributors what they need to know as leaders. There are a lot of barriers in the modern workspace to inclusion, a lot. You can't do all of them at once. You'll never actually start your company if you do, but you need to know if you have somebody who is in recovery and can't be someplace with alcohol. You need to know if there's somebody who needs space for parenting duties. You need to know, it can be anonymous, but if somebody on your team, if you get this anonymous feedback that says, we need a space where, I have tinnitus and the ping pong table in the open office is killing me. Like, that's real. That's just as much of a barrier as the lack of a space for other things. The report card idea, I love. Consistent, transparent reporting. People treat, I've showed a lot of people these numbers, and they act as if I'm accusing them of sexism. I'm like, I'm counting. Is it, like, if that feels like an accusation, we ought to sit with that and dig into it, but doing that on the regular, annually, what are our numbers? Are they changing? Do we want them to change? Is this expected? I picked up a phrase, nothing about us without us, that if we're going to talk about benefit for women, benefit for disabled folks, benefit for whoever, and you don't have those people in the conversation, you are fooling yourselves. And then finally, the most concrete piece of advice that I give my colleagues and my friends is that when I grant somebody power in my organization, they get the talk. I always phrase it as a question. Do you give your people the talk? And they go, what talk? I said, well, the talk where, for most of the time, it's about transference. It's about the fact that human beings are exquisitely tuned to figure out what the boss wants and then do the thing that the boss wants. And you have to be very, very direct about what pleases you as a boss. And so I say, manager, if the bad thing happens, if there's an exploitation situation here, right, it's on you. You're the person with power. And this drives me batty when I see it again and again and again in organizations where Professor What's-It and the person from the lab, and it's usually Professor male and girl from the lab, and she has to leave to protect his career. The talk is that if that situation arises, you will leave. You're the one with power. I do expect all of my peers and colleagues to give the talk. Like, that should be the standard we hold ourselves to. So there's a point where this stuff becomes part of the job. And I want to end on an optimistic note. I went to the future recently. I went to WorldCon, which is the World Science Fiction Convention. And so authors speak a potential future into being. And if we like that potential future, we follow it. And at this science fiction convention, there was a space for gender pronouns on the name badge. I got a sticker that said it was my first WorldCon, and people were nice to me and showed me where stuff was. I've never ever seen that at any biotech conference. And I saw somebody with a feminist sticker, and I was like, how do I get one of those? That's the magic of it, because once you're curious, and you're saying, I want my cookie. I want my little ribbon. And it turned out you had to go and present yourself to this person with a bag of stickers. And she would say, well, what kind of feminist are you? It's an interesting question to have to answer. What came out of my mouth was, well, the kind where it's cost me a friend. I got my sticker. So the future exists. The future absolutely exists. The reason I believe this community has this way of being is that the very most senior people in the author community for sci-fi is incredibly diverse. There are physically disabled people. There are women who write under pen names as men. There are people of color. There are queer people. And so the very senior leaders who put these things together make it part of their job. With that, I'll close. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation.